Yeah, I'm Florian Stammler, and I'm the research professor for anthropology here at the Arctic Center in Rovaniemi at the University of Lapland. We have a team of around plus minus 10 people doing anthropological research here, which is really nice, and I love working with colleagues there. And the main field of expertise is basically Arctic cultural and social change and continuity, with a regional focus on Finland and the Russian North. The majority, yes. Basically, well, now these days I have two main field sites: one in Yamal and one in Sakha, Yakutia. And in both places I've spent a lot of time. But maybe now Yamal is fresher in the memories because I just came back from there, and I've been there for many months now. There, due to the corona restrictions, actually made me stay there for longer than initially anticipated. But that was a good experience too. I'm always careful with making these judgments for how extraordinary things are, because obviously we are biased in a way that things that we see changing seem important to us. But actually, like one of the projects that I had in the past that also involved, among others, herders from Yamal, but also involved Sami and other peoples, was on oral history and talking to elders about changes that they had seen and that their ancestors had let them know, and how that got transmitted throughout generations, and made me realize that some of the stuff that we see as so incredibly meaningful is actually leveled by other things that people have seen before. In that project, for example, people were talking a lot about how the Soviet Union came to the tundra, and then all these processes connected to it, and then pretty soon after that, like within one generation, the same people experienced the consequences of World War II, and I would say, like from these stories, I would say what people see now, it's definitely also very very significant, but I would guess the hardship that people experience was probably much more back then than it is now. In terms of a long-term influence on nomadic life, these changes may be even more significant. But I would guess the hardships are not that tough. I think so, very much. Specifically on Yamal, I think there's no better place to study continuity than that. If you take a sort of a longue durée approach, I mean, even visually, if you go there now in 2020 and actually witness people in their fur clothes and living in the chums that are covered with reindeer skins, 40 reindeer skins per half chum, so 80 reindeer skins you need for covering one chum, and still everybody does that, and people, people like it, and are convinced that that's the best way to actually live out there. Then that is already, it's a very material exemplification of continuity that you don't find in many other places, even in Yakutia, which serves for me always as a good comparison, because it's the same country, same political system, same sort of bigger like cultural background and so on, but there you don't have that continuity at all anymore. And most importantly, there is, I think, the family component. That has not changed on Yamal. You still have entire families being involved in nomadic life round the year, and that there are very few other places where people still do that in the 21st century. There are several types of events that science thinks is climate related. I think the most prominent, also through Bruce's work, and work that we've done before with Annette Barge is this rain on snow events, when there is a sudden warming, when there is a sudden warming happening on the reindeer pastures, so the upper layer of the snow melts, becomes water, and then refreezes, and that makes the pastures inaccessible for reindeer, and that is one of these disasters, because that means usually reindeer starvation, and even if it's not straight starvation, it means significant weakening of the reindeer, so that it's more likely that the herd suffers losses over the next spring, because spring, and we know that historically spring has always been the bottleneck. So when in the autumn a rain on snow event happens and the reindeer get weak because of that, they may make it through the winter, but then they may not make it through the spring. So the effects actually show usually next year, while many of the rain on snow events happen in the autumn or early winter. The significant factor here is that the frequency of these events increased heavily in the 21st century. The rain on snow as a phenomenon is not new at all to herders. Everybody knows about it, and the ancestors have been talking about it, and we know of past events. Herders tell about it and what they have been doing about it, and their strategies how to avoid it, and so there is a lot of knowledge around and a lot of wisdom on how to manage these disasters. But what is new is that they happen so frequently. Elders have been telling that it used to be that once in 30 years, so roughly once per generation, one of these big events happened, and that also means that there is enough time for a reindeer herd to recover. There's an Annette's term for this, which is called bad year. That these bad years they happen once per generation, and then the herd has time to recover, and then it's restored and it's part of life. But now when you have since the first one that I witnessed myself was in 2006. I was actually right there when this happened, and made this one photograph that has been then used in many different articles, where you can actually see a triple or double snow crust. And ever since, between 2006 and now, these events happened. I mean, not every year, but every second or third year. And after the big rain and snow event in 2013-14, 3 years in a row, smaller events after that happened too. So in 15, 16 and 17, I think. And that really was, the accumulation of these was what was the real disaster, I think. And I think that's something that I would like to study in Charter much more seriously. And what does this tell us about how we conceptualize disasters? Because we are used to conceiving of a disaster as a single event that has disastrous effect, like this Asian tsunami, for example, that costs like tens of thousands of lives, or earthquakes or so. It's a one-off event. I think here we need to extend our understanding of what a disaster is if we want to make real sense of the consequences, because it's much easier to mitigate the consequences of one event in comparison when this becomes a regularity, and you need to devise long-term management and mitigation strategies, and how to make sure that people can continue being reindeer herders. And I think that's something where we can learn much more, and where the Charter project maybe can contribute with better evidence as well. And I would hope that evidence is also then useful for decision makers, because we can see on the example of Yamal, for example, that they did pretty good in mitigating the consequences of the 2013-14 rain on snow event. But that was the usual perception of disaster. They thought, okay, now we are done with that, and now people can live on. And then no mitigation measures were undertaken for the 15, 16 and 17 disasters, and that's actually what cost people's livelihood. And so nowadays you have, there are no numbers, but there are many families who had to abandon nomadism altogether and now lead a sedentary way of life in villages. And I think that's the real disaster. It's a direct consequence, and nobody would doubt that among the herders, and they would say that straight away. And the reason is that this way of nomadism in Yamal, it relies on reindeer as a means of transport. And when your herd becomes so small that you can't transport your household anymore, you need to stop moving. On top of that, there's a whole range. The elders have been talking about that, of strategies how to restore your herd, and some of these indigenous ways of doing that are now have become impossible due to industrialization, the gas industry, and also due to legal changes. Some of the stuff isn't allowed anymore that people used to do for ages, for centuries. And so their possibility of restoring their herd is artificially limited.
Right.
And that contributes to the abandonment of a nomadic life among those people. The bottleneck is really the restoration cycle that cannot happen anymore. And there are natural sort of limiting factors as to how fast you can restore a reindeer herd, and if the frequency of the events actually goes over that threshold of the restoration cycle, then I think there's a serious problem. And I think one of the tasks that I would envision of coordinating in Charter is to establish that correlation between the restoration cycle and the frequency of the extreme events. Like, how often can they happen so that herders can still restore their herd, and where that threshold is, and is there actually a threshold like that?
Yeah.
And I think that's really new innovative research into natural disasters, because it goes beyond that understanding that it's only one event.
Right.
Well, very easy example. The traditional way of restoring your herd was fishing in the open Taz river bays, like where the open Taz rivers flow into the Arctic Ocean. That has been forbidden by law now, and people are not allowed to do that anymore. Earlier, people would fish and then would exchange that fish for reindeer from other herders, or would sell that fish on the market and get money for it and buy new reindeer with that money and restore their herd. Now that's forbidden by law, and people get very heavily fined, and the state fish inspection authorities are very efficient in controlling who fishes, and that nobody fishes in those areas where the richest fishing grounds are.
I see.
And so that traditional way of restoring your herd isn't there anymore. You can't do it, at least not legally. And illegal fishing means taking a very, very high risk, because these are fines that are that's proper big money. It's not like you pay like 10 euros or so. You pay like 30,000 euros or so as a fine when you're caught. And that for a reindeer herder, I mean, imagine. This is, it's a lifetime debt that you need to pay off. Officially, that law is passed for protecting the fish population, because the white fish in the open Taz Bay is very precious. It's those fish that is basically endemic to Siberia. So the Nelma omul and Muksun species. But then the herders are very ambivalent about the real goals for that, because they see that actually there have been accidents in connection to oil and gas drilling in these areas where the richest fishing grounds are, and a lot of fish has been dying because of that, they believe. And so so there's this view that it's really not fair that first the industry kills the fish and then later a law is passed to protect what is left over.
Yeah.
Because it's actually not their fault that the population is gone. And they also doubt that they got the numbers right.
Okay.
And there is a whole history actually in Arctic anthropology in uncovering that in the assessment of fish and marine mammal populations, indigenous traditional ways of knowing the water are not properly considered. My friend and colleague Piers Witebski keeps telling that story from the Alaska Native Whaling Commission, where they were being told that they can't kill any whales anymore. There has to be a moratorium because the whale is gone, and they said we actually do know that there is whale around, and so they hired a team of biologists and they would show them where the whale are. And their study, but they needed to have these bloody colonial biologists to prove that they're really there, because indigenous knowledge is not good enough to be believed in.
Right.
So they hired these biologists, and the biologists found the whale, and they said yes, it's there, and then they were allowed to hunt. Something like that is not happening on Yamal. Nobody does that, and that's also a political issue, obviously. I think in Charter we are probably not going to touch upon these issues, but I think what's going to be significant is that we shall look based on our fieldwork evidence on how can we reconceptualize the idea of a disaster.
Right.
And of an extreme event. In Yakutia there has been a paper published as well where the author suggests that we actually reconceptualize this based on the indigenous ways of understanding, not as an extreme event, but as an extreme process. Yes, that's one direction, and then the other direction, of course, is the general grazing governance. Because Charter in general, obviously, it's in that bigger framework of biodiversity changes, and obviously one significant factor in biodiversity is the vegetation cover that we have in the Arctic, and changes in that, and of course that's climate related, but that's also land use related. Reindeer herding is one of the ways of using the land, but also maybe the industrial use of land for gas extraction or coal mining or whatever. And so obviously there are policy challenges in how to organize the movement of people and animals across the land, and especially after the big losses in reindeer in these rain on snow events, and the reduction of nomadic households in the tundra that has happened as a result. Obviously, that has led to lively discussions among decision makers as well. What can be done to reorganize that? Because the history of that is that there was the reindeer density, specifically on the Yamal, in the Yamal area, was exceptionally high, and all the biologists were saying that the entire area is heavily overgrazed. And so while some herders were saying, well, the big losses is sort of a natural response to that, and now we have less people and less animals, decision makers are saying, well, that's a sign we need to reorganize the entire grazing governance. And what we're seeing now is, for example, and that makes work in Charter possibly very beneficial, is that in Siberia they started to fence reindeer pastures and invite nomads to become herders in these fenced areas, and that's obviously an experience that speaks very well to the history of reorganizing Sami reindeer herding in Finland, where all the Paliskunnat have been undergoing these fencing measures, and we have already these existing studies of the influence of fences. For example, the border fence between Norway and Finland, just north of Juha Maga's pastures, Now that there's a lot of experience on that. I think within Charter it would be nice if we can facilitate more exchange on that, so that existing experiences can be shared and maybe mistakes avoided, for making sure that that actually the reindeer herding in other places where these transformations happen now can be continuing. Well, it's happening in several places, and it's a big diversity of measures, and it's not again, it's not that one-sided, and it would be nice if in Charter we could map that diversity first, because fences itself is like anthropologically it's an incredibly interesting topic, because there is a history of fences that are actually telling about herders' own agency, fences as guiding the movement of reindeer according to the plans of the herders themselves. And that's really cool. And for example, when we organized a meeting between Sami and other Arctic herding peoples in last September, Juha Maga was showing us the remains of old reindeer fences in Näkkälä Paaliskunta.
Right.
That was amazing, and it was like, I mean, of course there are no fences anymore, but there are holes, and so they used structures and enclosures for the ancient reindeer hunt, even before reindeer herding came around in the first place. And then of course we have corrals for the roundup of reindeer, where the fence is also being used for reindeer herding, whereas the fences that states built, they are actually against reindeer herding, really. They cut into migration routes, and they screw up seasonalities and reorganize everything, and that's what we are seeing in Yamal now too. In Yakutia, for example, what we're seeing is that the herders themselves built very, very long fences to guide reindeer movement, to prevent them to get too close to industry.
I see.
And also running way too far in the forest where the wolves would eat the reindeer.
Okay.
And so again, that's actually the fences as an instrument to help guide reindeer movement, whereas the fences built by the administration inhibit reindeer movement.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think in Charter we should try to map both, because it's not that obvious always what actually the purpose of a fence is, and administrations like the one in Yamal, I think use that ambiguity by saying, well, actually what we do is we help the herders to preserve their herds by building these fences and encouraging them to change their lifestyle into fenced herding, because there is a shortage of pasture and because there is a danger of losing the animals, and that increases the control and blah blah. These different orientations of fences, they can go together sometimes, and it's important to figure out. And I see it as our task there in Charter to map what actually the herders' views about this are, and they are very controversial. Obviously, you can't. We have enough competence of not falling into this trap of saying that the reindeer herders see fences like this and that, because there are proponents and opponents, obviously, and there are pluses and minuses on both sides, and both sides have good arguments. And our preliminary discussions, like last September, when the people from Yamal and Yakutia joined Juha Maga, for example, and they had talks about that, and that became very clear. Juha was very critical about all the stuff happening with the fences, and urged everybody to be very careful about using the fence as an instrument, because it sort of may come as a Trojan horse.
Right.
That first looks convenient because it reduces workload, and then actually fires back, because you lose freedom of movement.